On the fourth Friday of each month, from February to November, the museum puts on a talk, and you can watch the videos. They're published on YouTube. Subscribe, it's free, and click the bell, and you'll be notified when the videos become available. Thank you for watching.
Good morning and welcome again. Since European settlement in 1803, defence was a high priority, continuing through to the end of World War II in 1945, with more than 200 invasion scares alone in the 19th century. Early anxieties were around the French and Russian aggression during the gold rush, and further global powers, including the United States and Japan, were also considered potential threats as international tensions evolved. Melbourne's transformation as one of the most significant cities in the British Empire and the immense wealth generated by Victorian goldfields made the colony both strategically important and potentially vulnerable in times of conflict. By the Second World War, defence systems protecting Port Phillip Bay had evolved into a sophisticated network capable of safeguarding vital sea lanes across Bass Strait, controlling entry through the heads, and protecting the major industrial and administrative centres of Melbourne and Geelong. This presentation traces the development of coastal defences at the heads over more than 80 years, from the early fortifications of the 1860s to the complex three-dimensional defence systems of the 1940s. It also considers how today's Australian Defence Force continues to study these historic fortifications, recognising that lessons from the past can help inform contemporary strategic thinking. Our presenters today are Dr. Bob Marmion on my left and Andrew Dagg. Dr. Bob Marmion has maintained a lifelong interest in Australian military and police history, particularly the colonial era through the end of the Second World War in 1945. He served for 15 years with Victoria Police in both uniform duties and criminal investigation branch as a detective. Following his policing career, Bob undertook university study as a mature age student, completing a PhD in Victorian military history at the University of Melbourne. He has written and presented widely on the defence of Victoria and has long-standing association with Fort Queenscliff. Bob is Secretary of the Fort Queenscliff Heritage Association and contributes actively to the Fort's heritage, education and training programs. Andrew Dagg was born in Northumberland, England, and served in the Royal Engineers before a second career as a registered nurse. He emigrated to Australia in 1997 and held senior health management roles in rural New South Wales before relocating to Victoria in 2016. Pursuing a long-standing interest, Andrew completed a Masters of Arts in Military History at the University of Wolverhampton in 2022, researching pre-Federation Victorian naval defences. In 2023, he presented on Victorian coastal defences at the Australian Chief of Army History Conference. Andrew is Treasurer at Fort Queenscliff Heritage Association and is currently a PhD candidate with the University of New South Wales, Canberra at the Australian Defence Force Academy. I'd like you to welcome Dr. Bob Marmion and Andrew Dagg. Thank you. Thank you.
The topic for our presentation today is the development of the Port Phillip defences at the heads between 1860 and 1945, basically the history of the fort. This talk is based on our presentation at the Chief of Army History Conference in November 2023, which in turn is based on our book, A Military History of Victoria, Australia. We'll have to put that in. 1803 to 1945, Gibraltar of the South.
Look, I'd like to talk a little bit about the reasons why defence was so important and why we have a fort here at Queenscliff and Point Lonsdale defences. When you think about it, there were over 200 defence invasion scares in the 19th century alone. And that meant that defence was a major concern to both society and to government and to the people, the colonists. They thought, are we going to be invaded? So the original threat was perceived back in 1803 when Sorrento was first, a settlement was there, and they built a sand battery. And they brought ashore some guns from a Royal Navy ship and set up the first defences. In 1826, another battery was focused at Rhyl on Phillip Island, but the French never materialised inside Port Phillip Bay, so the threat of attack passed. But during the gold rush in the 1850s, there was a different kettle of fish altogether. We were talking about the Crimean War between 1853 and 1856. And the amount of gold that was stored in Melbourne and being passed through Melbourne to the UK was absolutely staggering. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of kilograms of gold. So it meant that Melbourne had now passed from a simple little village on the banks of the Yarra in 1836 to a thriving metropolis by the end of the 1850s. And it was a huge target for any invasion or any potential overseas threat. So defence again raised its head. At various times during the 19th century, the United States was even regarded as a threat to the British Empire. There was a potential of war during the Civil War. France, Germany, later Japan, but of course Russia was the bogey bear right through the 19th century. The amount of gold that passed through meant that Melbourne had transformed, and it eventually became a major industrial centre. And by the 1940s especially, it was an industrial and agricultural hub, as was Geelong. So it was critical to the war effort. And by the Second World War, it had to be defended. So what we're going to look at is how the defence has changed from the 1860s right through to 1945 and why it needed to be defended. So I think we're all pretty well familiar with the outline of Port Phillip Bay. We're talking about the bay being approximately 50 kilometres north-south, 40 kilometres east-west. There's really one main shipping channel which runs South Channel, turns left at the Hovell Pile and heads towards Melbourne. It's about a 75 kilometre journey. To the left is Corio Bay, and when you look at the east-west of Corio Bay and Port Phillip Bay, it's about 75 kilometres. It's about 50 kilometres as the crow flies, but ships don't fly as the crow flies, so they have to follow the shipping channel. Now, what I'd like to talk about is the topography and bathymetry, and you get bonus points if you know what bathymetry is, because when I first started looking at this, I had no idea. Topography being the description of the earth from two ancient Greek words, topos and graphos, and it's about mountains and rivers and valleys and landforms and things like that. But bathymetry is the underwater version of topography. It shows channels, peaks, troughs, and so on. So topography and bathymetry were incredibly important to the defence, and what we need to do is show how important, because the whole defence was based on this. So when we look at the heads, they're approximately 3 kilometres wide, but the shipping channel is only about 1 kilometre because of rocky outcrops. There's two main channels. There's the west channel going towards Geelong, which is quite shallow by comparison, and there's the deeper south channel. Sandsoils are located inside the heads, especially around the south channel. So any shipping coming through the heads must follow either of two channels, the west channel or the south channel. On the west side of the Ballaroon, we have Shortlands Bluff, which stands 24 metres above sea level. And on the other side is the Nepean side, which stands about 18 metres above sea level, rising to 42 metres above sea level. So it's actually quite a large land formations on either side of the heads. This dark blue mark here is the most incredibly dangerous entrance to Port Phillip Bay. It's probably one of the worst or most dangerous stretches of water in the world because of the conflicting tides and currents. But once inside, you must, if you're a ship's captain, you must follow one of two channels, the west channel or go to the right on the south channel. Okay, I'll pass over to Andrew.
In case you haven't ever seen it, that is pointing a pin with a ship in front of you, and just to show how close they are. Shortlands Bluff. In 1860, Captain Peter Scratchley Royal Engineers arrived in Melbourne at the behest of the Victorian government to advise on the defence of Melbourne. And in a couple of years, the first battery was built at Queenscliff on Shortlands Bluff. The battery could cover both channels with its guns, but there was a catch. The 68-pounder smoothbore cannon didn't have the range needed. In Scratchley's original plan, there would have been actually batteries built all the way along the coast up to Melbourne and dotted around Geelong. If that vision had gone ahead, there wouldn't have been an issue with the range of the guns. But however, the Victorian government couldn't make up its mind. Should they defend Melbourne at Melbourne, or should they defend it at the Heads? On top of that, there wasn't enough money to push ahead with the bigger defences, so most of the plans just faded away and were scrapped. But that wasn't all. The situation was made worse by a few other issues. There just wasn't enough modern rifled guns. Scratchley had hoped for the new Armstrong large calibre rifled breech loaders, but they were scarce and not getting released from UK. The right people to operate them were also in short supply. There was no Imperial Royal Artillery batteries available to service the colony. Plus, Queenscliff was the only town on the Heads, so only the volunteers could be from Queenscliff if the guns were needing to be manned, so therefore the guns had to be on the west side, resulting in Shortlands Bluff. This battery was constructed and manned by local volunteers. However, if there was a call out, by the time they arrived on site to man the guns, an enemy ship would have sailed through and gone on its way to Melbourne or Geelong. And actually, this situation happened on a number of occasions. So you'd wake up in Melbourne with a Russian ship. Now, where did that come from? In the 1880s, saw the real development of the forts at the Heads, following a couple of serious war scares. Bob mentioned the Crimean War, but in 1874-75, you had the big game where the Russians were moving towards Afghanistan, and the British were scared of them maybe attacking into India. And even after that, by 1884, there was an even bigger war scare where Victorian government actually mobilised the armed forces and the forts. Building on the plans of the 1860s and utilising the same bathymetry and topography, Major General Sir William Jervis Royal Engineers, aided by the now Colonel Peter Scratchley, developed plans to improve the positions and create new forts able to cover the channels and anchoring spots. This included the addition of minefields, the blue boxes on the map, and the South Channel Fort, built on a man-made island to specifically cover the channel and the minefield. There was also improvements in gunnery ordnance, through an 80-pounder rifled muzzle loader to breech-loading hydro-pneumatic disappearing guns of various calibers from 5-inch to 9.2-inch. And you saw an example of that at the very beginning. These were also crewed by men of the Victorian Artillery, a permanent force rather than a volunteer force. And in addition, electric searchlights were now installed on positions on both sides of the head to illuminate ships at night. I mean, and these, when we talk searchlights, the story is they were so powerful that the searchlight at Queenscliff, if you were in Point Nepean, you could read a newspaper. It was that bright. To further strengthen the defences in the event of hostilities, submarine mines, first developed in the American Civil War, were to be laid in the channels, which was the 2 blue boxes that we mentioned there. This was actually done on at least one occasion. Known as torpedoes at the time, they were both contact and electrically fired from observation points, as can be seen in this 1884 plan. Importantly, the laying, maintenance and firing of the mines was the responsibility of the Victorian permanent engineers, not the Navy, as it is nowadays.
The key period under discussion is first of all the 1880s and then the 1940s. But during the 1880s, Victoria actually led the way in imperial thinking when it came to defence. When we look back at the 1860s, for example, Scratchley said, look, Melbourne should be defended at the heads. But there was a debate for the next nearly 20 years. The heads or Melbourne? The heads or Melbourne? And eventually the Imperial government said, well, make up your mind. Come on, now which one is it? So by 1870, the late 1870s, when Jarvis and Scratchley came back, they decided on defending the heads. And one of the key problems, as Andrew said, was the lack of a garrison. The Queenscliff volunteers of the 1860s were citizens of Queenscliff. They were business people, tradespeople, the doctor. There was a whole range of people who volunteered part-time. But the problem with the 1860s and 70s was the lack of forewarning. In 1862, a Russian ship, the Bogatyr, came through and nobody noticed. It turned up in Melbourne. The following year, the Svetlana turns up. Same thing happened. 1865, January, the Confederate raider the Shenandoah turned up, and it's in Melbourne and nobody noticed. So there was no forewarning. So in 1870, when the Imperial garrison left, they formed the Victorian Artillery to man the battery on a full-time basis. And at least there, they were ready if a potentially enemy ship passed through. It still didn't quite solve all the problems, because in 1885, the commander of the Victorian Navy woke up one day, looked out his bedroom window and saw a Russian warship. Didn't know about it. But eventually, forewarning became a huge part of the defences. So by the 1880s, Victoria's finally made a decision to defend Melbourne at the heads. So we now have a coordinated defence scheme. For the first time in imperial history, in the Empire, we had the first defence department. We had the first defence minister. We had the first scheme of defence, where the Victorian Navy, the Cerberus and the Nelson and the various other ships, torpedo boats, combined with the land forces and the forts to actually defend the heads. And this was constantly updated right through the 1880s. So combined with the torpedo fields, again, was a fourth element. It meant that Victoria had a very comprehensive defence scheme based on the heads. In fact, it was so comprehensive and so regarded as so effective that we were known as the Gibraltar of the South, which was a sobriquet that continued right through into the 1940s. So an enemy ship had to run a gauntlet. First of all, they had to get through into the heads and then into the South Channel. And if you look at the map, you can see they would have to pass into the minefields. And there was also a series of forts, Nepean, Eagle Nest Battery, Fort Franklin. The one marked Fort on its own, top right, is actually South Channel Fort. And then there's Fort Queenscliff and Swan Island to the left. So the effect became a hammer and an anvil approach. The Victorian Navy was inshore, and it was forcing an enemy ship against the shore batteries. So the hammer and anvil effect was quite effective. It was never put to the test, but it was designed and they got it right. So even though Scratchley identified this problem 20 years earlier, the Victorian government finally said, mate, you're right, okay, and we'll build the defences. So land forces were on both sides of the heads to defend the batteries in case there was an invasion. And this was one of the other problems I'll talk about shortly, is we thought if you take the batteries from behind, a ship could sail through. So you needed land defences. Okay, by 1914 and 18 war, there were 8 forts ringing the heads. And as you can see from the curved arcs, these are the arcs of fire. So a ship would actually come under fire from multiple batteries if it passed through the heads. The question was often raised, did the fort ever fire a shot in anger? Well, Fort Queenscliff was the headquarters of the fortress at the heads, and it did on one occasion. In 1914, a German steamship, the SS Fels, tried to make a run for it upon the outbreak of war, and they thought they were going to get away with it, but the signal had been passed to Nepean, stop the Fels, do not let it go through the heads. So they fired a shot across the bow, and there was an argument between the pilot and the ship's captain, and the pilot said, mate, the next one's going to be amidships, you better pull over. So it eventually it stopped, the ship was seized, the crew were arrested, and the Fels became a wartime troop transport for the rest of the war. Now, probably the big difference between the 1880s and 1914 was the Victorian Navy no longer existed. At Federation, the ships were passed over to the Commonwealth, and I think it was about 1911 that the Royal Australian Navy was formed. And instead of concentrating on defending Port Phillip, the Royal Australian Navy was now defending out into Bass Strait. So basically the fort system and the minefields all remained intact, but naval focus had moved out into Bass Strait.
1942 is a great introduction of technology to what's already there. So 4 main technological additions were added to reinforce the heads. Indicator loops to detect incoming submerged submarines by magnetic detection and that. The dotted lines and that. The magic eye, infrared beams to detect incoming ships or boats, particularly in night or in fog. Great idea, new technology, set too low at first because of waves and everything kept, when it got stormy, it kept hitting the lights and setting off the alarms and everything, but so they raised them up and everything. So it wasn't a great success, but it's a very early example of it. And finally, radar. It was set up to increase early detection right out into the Bass Strait. In this map of the multi-layered defence system, the actual defences at the heads remain the same, namely forts and minefields, with their supporting elements of searchlights, indicator loops and infrared beams. The advent of radar pushed early detection out from the coast. There were 6 radar units were established that covered the coast from Cape Otway to the New South Wales border, particularly approaches to Port Phillip Bay. From the declaration of war against Germany in September 1939, maritime patrols scoured Bass Strait for U-boats and mine-laying surface raiders, such as the Cormorant, which sank the HMAS Sydney. And the fort was on active duty from the 3rd of September 1939. One layer built on another to make approaching Melbourne very difficult, if not near impossible. Defence of Melbourne and Geelong now begins well out into the Bass Strait, not just at the heads.
We're actually doing a study for the Australian Army at the moment on defending. How do you defend Australia? The Army is so used to offensive operations like Afghanistan and Iraq that they say, well, how was it done in the past? So one of the key problems is how do you defend the defences? So having fixed defences is good in some respects, but it means that all the guns and searchlights and everything else are fixed in one position, and therefore they're open to attack from behind. So in the 1860s, the open battery had no rearward defences, just a picket fence. It was nothing there. In the 1880s, the defence planners decided on the wall, the keep, the moat, which has since been filled in, but essentially it was about protecting the back or rear of the batteries. In 1880s, for example, they also had entrenchments at the Narrows, and they were simple trenches, gun positions, but highly, shall we say, ineffective. There's an account of the Victorian Mounted Rifles simply outflanking them by riding their horses along the beach. So it was an effort. What happened though by the Second World War, they thought, no, we've seriously got to do something here. So they began a comprehensive defence scheme extending from Fort Queenscliff all the way around to Torquay, because they looked at the invasion sites. One of the things that Scratchley and Jarvis looked at was, if there's an invasion, you know, a full-on invasion involving ships and troops, where would they likely land? And they identified a whole range of points from Torquay to Breamley to Barwon Heads, around a point Lonsdale and the back of Queenscliff. So the 1940s planners said, okay, well, how do we defend these areas? And what they did was they actually set up a defence in depth. So if you look at the red line, the first thing they did was build an anti-tank ditch. And they thought that potentially there were going to be Japanese tanks coming ashore. Now, an anti-tank ditch was something like about 6 metres wide, 5 metres deep, and the idea was that a tank would actually drive into the ditch and not be able to get out, as if they do that. But in effect, it would stop tanks from approaching. So it extended from the other side of Port Arlington Road on Swan Bay, across the Port Road, up over the top near Suma, and across the highway, and then down, zigzagging all the way to Lake Victoria and the coast. Now, there were 3 tank ditches planned, but they actually only built one. And a few years ago, we actually followed the course. We used a 1944 map and followed the course, and you can actually still see where some of the tank ditch is. Some parts are now still exist, but they're filled with water, but you can get an idea. The other thing they did was they built various checkpoints on highways and the railway line, so that any vehicles passing along the Geelong Road, for example, would have to go through a military checkpoint. And it was covered with machine guns, rifles, searchlights and barbed wire entanglements, and there were foxholes as well. So troops were manning these positions 24/7. They also had a number of key targets, like Suma, for example, thinking that if it was occupied by the enemy, the guns over at Nepean could actually fire across the heads and target Suma. So they worked out the ranges, they worked out the exact bearings and how to actually hit that target. And all across the Bellarine, targets were identified as potential dangerous spots in case of an enemy attack. You're probably familiar with the concrete bunkers that exist between Queenscliff and the Narrows along the path. They extended everywhere. They were all the way around to Breamley and near Torquay. And they were, again, barbed wire entanglements, foxholes, machine gun positions. In addition, there were barbed wire entanglements on the Lonsdale Bight, extending along the beach with searchlights, but also out about 10 to 15 metres out into the water. And these barbed wire cores were a metre across. They were quite extensive. So there were extensive defences on how to defend and keep an enemy away from the fortress. One of the biggest problems they realised, and this didn't really come to fruition until the 1930s, was potential for air attack. Germany had been developing the blitzkrieg theory of using ground and air assets in an attack. And it suddenly dawned on Australian planners that we need to do something about air attack. So what they started to do was bring in anti-aircraft guns. Initially it was obsolete First World War guns, and they were virtually useless. By 1942 there were extensive batteries of 3 to 6 guns of heavy anti-aircraft, which would reach up to 30,000 feet high, and the light anti-aircraft, the Bofors, which would cover about 10,000 feet. So it was a multi-level anti-aircraft defence. And luckily, we were never attacked by Japan. I'll talk to you about it in a minute, about the flight. But in January, February 1942, the Japanese attacked Rabaul Fortress. and which was very similar to Queenscliff, and they totally demolished it. They captured Rebelle, and it was air attack that knocked out all the guns. So it became even more critical to defend the fortress. In February 1942, a Japanese submarine out in Bass Strait launched a float plane flown by Warrant Officer Fujita, and he flew over Fort Queenscliff, flew around the bay, went over Point Cook, got lost in cloud, dropped below the cloud, realised he was over a raft base and said, "Oh dear," and got back up into the cloud. Flew over Williamstown, and I interviewed a fellow who was on an anti-aircraft battery at Williamstown, and he said to his officer, "It's a Jap plane." And he said, "No, it's American. No, it's Jap. No, it's American. No, it's Jap. No, it's American." And eventually it just flew out of range and not a shot was fired. So Fujita completely logged where all the defences were around the heads, and it was just incredible that he survived. So defending the fortress became an incredibly important part of the defences. You needed outward projection, but you also needed to defend the assets as well. And this is a key point that the Army's now looking at. It's all very well to set up missile batteries and things like that facing outwards, but how do you protect them? So we're looking at working with the Army to talk about how it was done in the past and how it could be, the lessons from the past could actually be used. So the biggest lesson that has to be learnt is you can't have fixed defences anymore. They must be mobile and they must be defended. So the other key lesson that's come out of looking at the fortress at the heads is the development of technology. Over the years, we went from simple muzzle loading 68-pounder smoothbore guns, range of about 2,000 yards, fired a big cannonball, lucky if they hit a target, right through to the advanced 3D defences that Andrew outlined of using radar to forewarning. So the technology completely changed over this 80-odd year period, and that's the key to having defences now. What do we do about the lessons of history? Is anybody following what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz? It's exactly the same thing that's happened, the defence thinking here, and that's why the Army is so interested in what we've got here and how we operate it. So, that's it. Okay. All right, so we're happy to take questions.
Can I just ask a question about, you talk about the barbed wire out of the heads.
Yes.
Would the ships ram into that?
No, it only extended about 10 metres off the shore. So it was like a sort of a right angle. Gary?
Bob, why wasn't Point Lonsdale nominated in the first place as a defence? I mean, we went to Queenscliff, but why not Lonsdale?
Scratchley, when he arrived in 1860, did a survey, and he wanted to set up a triangular defence system, Queenscliff, Lonsdale and the Nepean. But when it came down to it, one was cost. They weren't going to spend the money on setting up 3 batteries, and it couldn't be manned. The only people available to man them was from Queenscliff. So there just weren't the troops or people at Lonsdale. But in 1942, the Lonsdale battery, which the remains are still there to the right of the lighthouse, was built. So after Fujita's flight, when he flew over and saw all the guns at Queenscliff, they said, well, hang on, we need to move them. So they moved 2 of the guns over to Lonsdale, and it became the main defence. The guns at Queenscliff were wasted firing across the heads. Their range was so great that they could fire out into Bass Strait. So it wasn't until 1942 that Lonsdale became a major part of the defences.
Well, can you tell us a bit more about Pope's Eye and how it was used in the defences?
Right. When they originally looked in the late 1870s at defending the heads, Pope's Eye was planned as a fort in its own right, and they actually it was a man-made construction. So they built the annulus, and by that stage they realised that the new guns on Swan Island had sufficient range to cover Pope's Eye. So there wasn't any point in continuing to Pope's Eye.
One point to add to that, it is not where the Cerberus parks up, which is a common myth that we keep getting.
Yeah. The Cerberus drew too much water to park in Pope's Eye. And if you've been there, you know how shallow it is. Yeah.
Do you know when the moat was filled in? People probably don't realise, but there was a dry moat right round the fort, an inch. I don't know when it was dug out, or I don't know when it was actually filled in.
We've got a photo dated in 1885 where it's been dug, and you can see people in there with picks and shovels digging it. So it's definitely about 1885 that it was dug. We haven't got anything conclusive to say when it was filled back in, but we have been told that Italian prisoners of war were involved in filling it in 1944-45.
Is there a documented management plan and protocol for care of the existing facilities at the fort?
There is a management plan, but it's years out of date. It was a conservation management plan done, I think, 20 years ago.
20 years,
Yeah, so it needs to be updated. I don't know if you're familiar with the signal station or flag station. They allocated $1.4 million to restore that, and then when divestment came along, they pulled the funding on that, and it's in a mess. It is falling down. It badly needs refurbishment. So that's probably the high priority on when it comes to management, conservation management, is to restore the signal tower.
Can you tell us something about the origins of the keep and the wall itself? When were they built? And obviously it's a perimeter protection, but what was it designed to protect?
Built between 1882 and 1885. So the wall and the keep are really reminiscent of a medieval castle, and I reckon they were useless. I think they were designed to keep the townspeople out of the fort. Why I say that is the wall could have easily been demolished. If you brought a gun ashore, like the United States Navy had a boat howitzer, which was designed to come ashore in a rowboat, and if you had something like that, you just set it up 300 metres away and just blow the wall down. And that was recognised back in about 1886. There were a series of drawings of a mock attack on the fort, and what the Russians do, knock the wall down and went straight through. So the keep, the wall itself was actually made out of bricks, and that was designed to, rather than shatter and create dangerous splinters flying into people, they were designed to dismiss or break down. So there was a certain type of brick. The keep has metre wall thickness walls, and it's 3 stories, and it was designed as a place of last resort. So, and the same with the moat, medieval. It would slow people down, but not much else. It was a dry moat, so there were no alligators or anything there. Yeah, but one of the things that when I first looked at this, you've put a sniper in the tower at Lathamstow, for example, it could fire over the wall straight into the gun positions. So if I was an enemy commander, I would occupy Lathamstow or the Royal Hotel and put snipers up in the towers. So the wall and the keep and the moat were there for appearance, but played very little realistic effect on the defence.
I think the elephant in the room is what's going to happen to Queenscliff Fort.
I knew somebody would ask that. Andrew and I represent the Fort Queenscliff Heritage Association. We do not represent or talk for defence, so we need to make that quite clear. Now, if you want to know about the divestment, check out the Fort Queenscliff on the Defence website, and it's got all the facts and figures, the bare essentials that you need to know. If you want to know about possible sale, go to the Department of Finance, put in Fort Queenscliff and register as an interested party, and you'll be notified of any changes or anything that's developing. So that's one thing. Now, as far as the association's concerned, our recommendation, or what we would like to see, is that the fort remain in public hands, and open to the public and preserve the history and heritage. So those three things are critically important.
One idea that we certainly are following and we've suggested to various MPs and things like that is trust, similar to the Sydney Harbour Trust, which when there was a divestment 20 odd years ago up in Sydney and that, a lot of the defence sites there, Cockatoo Island, part of Garden Island and various other spots, were put under a trust. And and they would be funded by a Commonwealth that would come under the Department of Tourism or Environment or whatever it is at the time. And they would have the management of the site, or the sites as in Sydney's case and that. So it wouldn't be a private sale, and any development or anything that happened on the site would have to be done through the board of the trust, which would then allow them to make, to look after the heritage and protect that, but also make use of some of the facilities. For example, if you look at Fort Queenscliff today, there was a building built there in the 1980s, which is obviously not heritage. But that is actually a big, was for when it was the Command and Staff College, and it's a instructional facility. It has two big auditoriums for teaching and things like that. You could all be sitting in an auditorium watching the talk, you know? So there is things, but that would have to be carefully managed. And which is why we're thinking a trust overall, a Commonwealth-funded trust would be the better idea. But it's not our decision.
Some great questions. So if you'd like to find out more, the association is also looking to new members. You can be a member of both, because I'm a member of both. So if you'd like to know any more about the fort, come and talk to us.
Well, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for coming along.